The letter arrived on a dull, overcast morning, when the fog rolled over the town like a slow-moving tide. Simon Hart didn't think much of it at first, just another envelope with the usual weightlessness of bureaucracy. He had long grown tired of the endless stream of formalities and legal documents that had become a staple of his adult life. But something about the letter felt different, a slight chill in the air as his fingers traced the elegant seal that held it shut. H.M. Lovell and Company. Solicitors was embossed in the corner of the envelope, a name he didn't recognize. Simon tossed the envelope onto his kitchen table and made himself a cup of lukewarm coffee. He had no intention of opening it just yet. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the usual whirl of deadlines and the half-finished novel gathering dust on his desk. But as the minutes stretched into an uncomfortable stillness, a nagging curiosity crept up on him. He wasn't used to waiting for things. With a sigh, he peeled open the envelope. The contents were stark, printed in a professional font that seemed to distance itself from the weight of what it contained. Dear Mr. Simon Hart, we regret to inform you of the passing of your uncle, Mr. Rupert Hart, a resident of Eastfield Manor. He left no immediate family behind, and as his sole remaining relative, you have been named the beneficiary of his estate. We request that you come to Eastfield Manor to settle the necessary arrangements. Your presence is required at your earliest convenience. Yours sincerely, H.M. Lovell, Solicitor. Simon stared at the paper for a long while, the words sinking in slowly. He hadn't seen his Uncle Rupert in over a decade. In fact, he had only vague memories of him. A reclusive man who lived in a remote part of the countryside, a place Simon had never even been. His uncle had always been a figure of mystery, a man who chose isolation over family, and Simon had been told little about his life, his past, or the reasons behind his solitude. He never thought much of the man, and after a brief, almost non-existent conversation at a family gathering years ago, Rupert Hart had vanished from his life entirely. Simon's gaze drifted to the photograph on the wall, a framed picture of his parents, both long gone, smiling brightly at a family gathering. The emptiness left by their absence was a familiar feeling. But this letter, this strange summons to an unfamiliar place, felt like something more, something heavier. He rubbed his eyes and stood up, leaving the letter on the table. He paced the room, the cold edges of his thoughts gnawing at him. Eastfield Manor, the name danced in his head like a forgotten ghost. A remote house in the hills, a place he hadn't thought of in years. The drive to Eastfield Manor was long and uneventful. Simon, stuck behind the wheel of his car, found his mind wandering to places it shouldn't go. The landscape outside his window gradually became more desolate, the road winding through dense woods and patches of fog that clung to the earth like something living, breathing. His headlights barely cut through the mist, and he could sense an oppressive weight pressing in on him from all sides. By the time he reached the turnoff for Eastfield Manor, the sun had set, and the road became little more than a shadow in front of him. The eerie stillness of the night, coupled with the twisted shapes of trees around him, made his skin prickle with unease. The manor itself seemed to rise out of the darkness like a creature from another time. It loomed on the horizon, its silhouette jagged and uneven against the blood-orange sky. As Simon's car approached the gates, he could make out the faintest outlines of high, rusted iron fences and overgrown hedges, all swallowing the land around them. The house itself seemed to swallow the last remnants of daylight. It was the kind of place one could imagine being trapped in, its walls pressing inward, keeping secrets of a long-forgotten past. The kind of place that whispered, "I am not finished with you yet." Simon drove up the long, winding driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel beneath him. He parked in front of the house, the sound of the engine dying in the silence that enveloped the place. For a moment, he sat still in the car, staring at the darkened windows of the manor. There was no light inside, and the house appeared empty, lifeless. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and the faint tang of something metallic, as if the house itself had been bleeding for years. When he stepped out of the car, the cool night air hit him like a slap. He didn't want to go inside. He didn't want to know what lay behind those walls. But there was no turning back now. The front door creaked open as he approached, a long, drawn-out noise that seemed to echo through the stillness, reverberating against his chest. The hallway inside was dimly lit by the faint glow of an old chandelier hanging precariously from the ceiling. A smell of must and decay filled his nostrils, and his feet dragged as he stepped inside, the heavy weight of the house pressing down on him with every step. The floorboards groaned beneath him, as if the house itself was alive and waiting. A voice in the back of his mind whispered, "You shouldn't be here." But Simon ignored it. He had a job to do, after all. He was here to handle the business of the estate, to do what was necessary, and then leave. As he wandered further into the house, he felt the distinct sensation of being watched. Every room seemed to hold its breath as he passed. The air grew colder, the shadows longer, and the walls seemed to close in on him with every step. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong here. The house was no ordinary house. It was as though it had been waiting for him to arrive, and now that he had, it had begun to wake. But Simon shook it off, unwilling to admit to himself the unease settling in his chest. It's just an old house, he told himself. Nothing to worry about. But then he heard it. A faint tapping, coming from somewhere upstairs. It was soft at first, almost like the sound of footsteps, tentative, cautious. But the house was empty. He was sure of it. The letter hadn't mentioned anyone living here. He froze in place, listening. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, moving across the upper floor, growing louder with every step. Simon felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It's just the house settling, he reasoned. Just the wind. But as the tapping grew louder, his heart began to race, and a deep sense of dread seeped into his bones. Simon didn't move for what seemed like an eternity, and then, with a trembling breath, he stepped back toward the door. But when he reached for the handle, he heard it. A voice, soft, almost a whisper, coming from somewhere in the dark recesses of the house. "Welcome home, Simon." The first few days in the house passed in a haze of discomfort, and Simon did his best to ignore it. The flickering shadows, the strange creaks at night, all things that seemed to belong to a house of its age. The house was old, decaying under the weight of time, yet somehow it felt more alive than it should. Simon chalked it up to his own unease. After all, he wasn't exactly thrilled by the prospect of selling off a stranger's property, let alone inheriting it. Yet, despite the cold air that clung to the old wood, despite the unsettling silence that stretched through the corridors like a phantom, Simon found himself listening to it. The house had a rhythm. Its floorboards groaned in particular ways. Its windows rattled with wind in ways that made no sense. It felt wrong, as if it were more than just the sum of its old materials, as if it were holding secrets in its very walls. But Simon dismissed it. He was here for work. Practicality. The house, like everything else in life, was just another problem to solve. But that didn't mean he could ignore the oddities. Not when they started creeping in on him more and more. It began with Buster. The dog had always been a calm, friendly creature, but now he would pace the rooms restlessly, his eyes scanning the corners of rooms with a kind of intensity that unnerved Simon. At first, Simon thought Buster was just adjusting to the new environment. Animals, after all, were sensitive to their surroundings, especially in strange, unfamiliar places. But as the days wore on, the dog's behavior grew stranger. Buster would sit by the bottom of the staircase, whimpering and growling in a low, rumbling way that Simon had never heard before. His hackles would rise, his fur standing on end, even though there was nothing there. Simon tried coaxing him, calling him upstairs, but Buster refused. The dog would tug at his leash, pulling him away, eyes wide with fear. As if something was up there, something that even Buster couldn't understand. Simon had tried to push it aside. "It's probably just the strange smells, the new house, the sounds settling," he muttered to himself. Yet, every time he went to bed, it seemed the house grew colder and the shadows deeper. He couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, as Simon sat at his desk writing, the flickering of his desk lamp seemed to have an unusual quality. It was subtle at first, a blink too long between flickers, an unnatural pause before it sputtered back to life. Simon, irritated but too tired to care, tried to adjust it. But the moment his hand touched the lamp, it went out altogether. He cursed under his breath and fumbled for the switch, but the lamp refused to turn on again. The house seemed to hold its breath around him, as though waiting. A cold draft swept through the room, brushing the back of Simon's neck. It was subtle, like the whisper of something unseen. But it felt wrong. He stood and moved to the window, peering into the yard outside. The moonlight poured down, illuminating the overgrown bushes, casting long, dark shadows across the grass. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches creaking under the weight of the night. It was quiet, too quiet. Simon shook his head, his breath fogging up the glass as he stared into the darkness. His mind was beginning to feel frayed, the exhaustion creeping into his bones. The ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway echoed in his ears. There it was again, that disjointed, fractured sound. A faint ticking, but this time it was wrong. He moved down the hallway, drawn to the source of the noise. The grandfather clock stood in the shadow of the staircase, its pendulum swinging slowly, with a weighty, mechanical rhythm. He glanced at the clock's face, but something felt off. It wasn't the time, it was the sound. Tick, 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 but the hands of the clock remained still, frozen at 3:02 a.m. Simon's heart skipped a beat. He took a step closer, his pulse quickening. How could it be ticking when the hands weren't moving? The air seemed to thicken around him, the house growing colder still, its every corner whispering in low, unsettling murmurs. Tick, tick, tick. There it was again, louder this time. And as Simon turned away from the clock, he could have sworn he heard a scratching noise, faint but unmistakable. From upstairs. He hesitated, his eyes darting back toward the stairs. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. No one was up there. There couldn't be anyone up there. But the scratching continued, a slow dragging sound like something or someone was clawing at the walls above. Simon's breath hitched in his throat, and for a moment he stood frozen, caught between fear and disbelief. Finally, the rational part of him took over. He had to check it out. The house was old, settling, probably a rat or something. He'd gone this far, hadn't he? He grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the stairs, each step creaking beneath his weight. The air felt thicker now, heavier with the presence of something unseen. He tried to shake off the feeling that the walls were watching him, but it was impossible. The feeling of being observed followed him like a shadow, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched ahead, dark and silent. But Simon could still hear it. That scratching. Scratching. Louder now, coming from the door at the end of the hallway. His feet felt like lead as he moved toward the door, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. There it was, a faint outline of the door in front of him. He reached for the knob, his hand shaking, and turned it slowly. It gave way with an almost imperceptible click. The door creaked open, the sound of the hinges grating in the silence. The room beyond was dark, but as Simon stepped inside, he felt a coldness settle over him. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. He scanned the room with his flashlight, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room, just out of the reach of the light. It was a silhouette, draped in darkness. No features, no form, just a presence. Simon's breath caught in his throat as the figure turned slowly, its movement fluid, almost unnatural. And for the briefest moment, Simon could swear he saw something, a face, pale and lifeless, staring at him with hollow eyes. The flashlight flickered, and when it came back on, the room was empty. Simon stumbled back, his pulse racing. He turned on his heel and fled down the hallway, his mind whirling. His heart hammered in his chest, and the house felt like it was closing in on him. He bolted downstairs, his legs trembling, and collapsed into the armchair by the fire. His breathing was ragged as he tried to calm himself. The house was silent again, too silent, as if mocking him. But it wasn't over. A low growl broke the silence. Simon's gaze shot to the corner of the room where Buster sat, staring intently at the staircase. His eyes were wide with fear, his fur bristling. The dog's growls were low, guttural, as though he sensed something Simon could not. Simon stood, his hands trembling as he moved toward the dog. But Buster didn't stop. He continued to growl, his eyes fixed on the staircase, unblinking. And then the scratching started again. Louder this time. Closer. The house was awake. And Simon was not alone. The evening settled into a thick, oppressive silence. The house felt colder than usual, the shadows stretching longer as the sun dipped beneath the horizon. Simon sat at his writing desk, staring at the screen in front of him, but the words wouldn't come. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but the steady rhythm of his thoughts had dissolved into a dull ache in his skull. His eyes wandered around the room, seeking some kind of distraction, but the heavy presence of the house pressed down on him. A faint sound echoed through the walls, soft at first, like the creak of wood expanding in the cold. Then louder, a thud. It was unmistakable, a sharp, sudden bang, like something heavy had fallen upstairs. The noise was so distinct, so urgent, it made Simon's heart leap in his chest. He froze. Did it come from upstairs? He wondered, his breath catching in his throat. Buster, lying at his feet, lifted his head at the sound, ears perked. The dog looked up at Simon with wide, startled eyes, then slowly, cautiously, turned his gaze towards the staircase at the far end of the room. His tail stiffened, and a low growl rumbled deep within his throat. "Buster?" Simon whispered, his voice tentative. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the floor, sending an uneasy shiver up his spine. The dog didn't respond. Instead, Buster stood, his paws softly patting across the floor toward the stairs. But he stopped just short of the first step, his body trembling. Simon felt a sudden chill race down his spine. It wasn't like Buster to act this way. The dog was always eager to explore, always by his side, but now he was rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on the darkness that seemed to pulse from the upper floor. Simon swallowed. I have to check it out, he thought, though a deep sense of dread twisted in his gut. He grabbed his flashlight from the desk drawer and clicked it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. He slowly rose from his chair, but the room around him seemed to stretch, the walls closing in just a little tighter with each step he took. The house creaked in protest, a low, ominous sound that made him flinch. He hesitated at the base of the stairs. Buster, stay here, Simon said in a low voice. But the dog, as though understanding the gravity of the situation, simply laid down on the floor, eyes still glued to the staircase. Simon took a tentative step forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. With each movement, the house seemed to stir, a faint sound here, a whisper there, as if it was aware of his every motion. He reached the stairs, his heart hammering in his chest, and slowly, deliberately began to ascend. The air grew thicker as he climbed, the light from the flashlight trembling in his hand as if it, too, feared the shadows lurking above. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before him, dark and foreboding. The door at the far end of the hall was ajar, just slightly, the faintest sliver of darkness visible through the gap. Simon's pulse quickened. That door hadn't been open earlier. He was certain of it. He took another step, the creak of the floor beneath him sounding unnaturally loud. The darkness seemed to press in around him, and the silence was deafening. Even his own breath felt too loud, too intrusive. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. There was no answer. Another creak echoed from upstairs, a slow, deliberate sound, as if the house itself was listening, waiting. Simon's heart skipped a beat. The air around him felt colder, colder than before. He could see his breath now, misting in the dim light. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, but Simon felt an unrelenting pull toward the room at the end. He couldn't explain it, but something inside him urged him to go there, to open the door. He took another step forward, his hand reaching for the doorknob. As his fingers brushed the cold metal, the house seemed to hold its breath. He pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark. No light, no movement. The air was thick with dust, thick enough to feel like a weight on his skin. The room was sparse, the bed unmade, and a wooden dresser stood against the far wall, its drawers slightly ajar. But it was the silence that struck Simon the hardest. It was as though the house had swallowed the sound, making it impossible to tell if he was truly alone or if someone, was hiding just out of sight. He stepped further into the room, his flashlight casting long shadows that danced eerily along the walls. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, each beat more erratic than the last. The room felt wrong, like it was not meant to be opened. Suddenly there was a sound, a low, unmistakable creak. It came from the far corner of the room. Simon spun around, his flashlight cutting through the air, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the darkness. His breath quickened. What was that? The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, suffocating. A sudden coldness brushed against his skin, a chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The room itself felt alive, its presence pressing in on him like an invisible weight. And then it happened. A door slammed shut. The violent noise echoed through the room, rattling Simon's bones, making him stumble backward in panic. His flashlight fell to the floor with a clatter, casting the room in shadow. The door, the one he hadn't noticed before, tucked in the far corner, had slammed shut with such force that the walls seemed to shake. Simon stood frozen, staring at the closed door, his breath ragged. He wanted to run. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to flee, to leave this cursed house behind. But his feet wouldn't move. His legs were like stone, rooted to the ground. The house seemed to hold him there, in that moment, as the cold crept deeper into his bones. Then, as though from a distance, he heard it, a whisper. Faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. It was a soft voice, but it was unmistakable. Leave now. Simon's eyes darted around the room, the walls closing in, the shadows stretching, reaching for him. His pulse raced, the whisper wrapping around his mind like a vice. He turned and fled, scrambling out of the room, his hands shaking as he grabbed the doorknob. The door flew open, and Simon stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, his mind reeling. But the hallway wasn't the same. The air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows were darker now, more oppressive. It felt as if the house was breathing, expanding and contracting with every step he took. He looked down the stairs and saw the faintest flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. Someone, was at the bottom of the stairs, standing motionless in the darkness. The dog Buster had never been so still, and for the first time, Simon understood. The house was not just haunted, it was alive. The air in the house had grown colder, an unsettling chill that Simon couldn't quite explain. It seeped into the walls, into the very fibers of the carpet beneath his feet. The floorboards creaked more now, as though they too were trying to make their presence known, protesting against Simon's every step. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. Something worse. Something alive. Simon had come to a strange understanding about the house, an understanding that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, but one he couldn't fully grasp. The house wasn't just old. It wasn't merely a building that had fallen into disrepair. It was as if the house itself had been waiting for him to come, to step into its grasp. He had entered the house with the intention of quickly settling his uncle's affairs, but now he wasn't sure what he was doing here at all. At night, when he closed his eyes, the darkness seemed to close in on him more tightly than it had before. The whispers, faint and unintelligible, seemed to come from everywhere. From the walls, from beneath the floorboards, from the very air itself. But when he opened his eyes, the silence would return, swallowing any trace of sound. His mind, always busy with thoughts and distractions, had begun to slow, becoming more fogged by the day. It was Buster who first noticed the messages. The dog had been restless for days, his behavior growing more erratic as the hours passed. He refused to leave Simon's side, sticking to him like a shadow. When Simon tried to coax him into the upstairs hallway, Buster had become frantic, scratching at the walls, barking frantically at the air. It was as though the dog could see something Simon could not. That evening, after yet another sleepless night of trying to work through the strange unease that hung over him, Simon wandered into the hallway to stretch his legs. He paused before the mirror that hung in the entrance. It had been there when he arrived, old and tarnished, the surface clouded with age and neglect. He glanced at his reflection, seeing only his tired, haggard face staring back at him. But something was off. The mirror had always been cracked, but tonight the fracture had widened. Thin, jagged lines of the crack ran through the glass like the veins of a leaf. Simon stared at it for a moment longer, unnerved by the strange shape that seemed to form in the reflection. Something he couldn't quite make out. But it was the words that appeared next that made his heart seize in his chest. He blinked, and there they were, as if they had been written there for years, waiting for him to look. "Time is lost." Simon's breath hitched in his throat. He pressed his palm to the glass, his skin cold against the surface. His reflection wavered, his fingers touching the words, as though he could erase them. But they didn't disappear. They lingered, stubborn and final. "Time is lost." The words echoed in his head, repeating themselves like a chant. He looked down at his hand, trembling slightly, then back at the mirror, where the words remained, stark and vivid. For a long, agonizing moment, he couldn't tear his eyes away. He couldn't shake the feeling that the words weren't just appearing in the glass, but were somehow seeping into his mind, sinking into his very soul. Time was lost. He didn't know what it meant, but it felt true. It felt real. Simon quickly wiped at the mirror with the sleeve of his shirt, desperate to erase the message, but when he pulled his hand away, the words didn't vanish. They were as clear as ever, lingering on the glass like a curse. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine, and for the first time, Simon was afraid. The next morning, the house greeted him in the same eerie silence. The air felt heavier, thick with something that wasn't quite right. The hours had stretched impossibly long the night before, but Simon couldn't remember where the time had gone. He couldn't remember when he had finally fallen asleep or when he had woken up. It was as though he had slipped into some other dimension, one where time didn't obey the rules. Buster was still nervous, his eyes darting around the room, always watching, always waiting for something Simon couldn't see. The dog's nervous energy had shifted to a subtle anxiety, a dread that weighed down on Simon like a stone in his chest. That afternoon, Simon noticed something strange again. As he passed through the hallway, he caught sight of a smear of red across the floor. He stopped, unsure if his eyes were deceiving him. But there, just under the faded wallpaper, was the unmistakable hue of crimson. His heart thudded in his chest. Red. It looked too fresh, too wrong. He crouched down to examine it, his fingers brushing against the wall. The scent of iron, sharp and metallic, filled his nostrils. He recoiled, heart hammering in his chest. The red stain was real. He didn't know what it was, but the smell lingered, choking the air. Simon straightened up, his mind racing. He didn't want to believe it, but the red smear, the words from the night before, were starting to feel like something sinister, something connected to the very essence of the house. He had to know more. Later that evening, as Simon made his way back downstairs, he heard something, a whisper barely audible. His name. It was faint, but it was there. He froze. The house was silent again, the only sound the creaking of the floor beneath his feet. The whisper didn't come again, but the sense of unease grew, wrapping itself around him like a tightening noose. He had to find out what was happening. He had to confront whatever was at work in this house. Simon returned to the hallway where the red stain had been, but now there was more. The smear had expanded, creeping across the wall in a thick trail of crimson. But this time it was different. This time there were words, jagged, crude, and unmistakably written by something other than human hands. "Don't leave." The message was stark against the wall, written in the same dark red as the stain. It was as if someone had smeared the words with their own hand. Simon recoiled, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He backed away slowly, almost instinctively, but his feet tangled in the rug, and he fell to the floor with a soft thud. When he stood and looked back, the message remained. A shiver crawled down his spine. Who had written it? And why? The days blurred together in a haze of confusion and fear. Every time Simon attempted to erase the words, they returned, stronger, more insistent, more detailed. The messages were coming faster now, showing up in every room, smeared across mirrors, windows, and even the floors. "This is your last chance." It appeared on the kitchen table, etched into the surface like something alive. "Leave now, or it will be too late." It was scrawled across the bathroom mirror, appearing as if the glass had been carved with a blade. Simon tried to escape, to leave the house, to run from whatever force was controlling it, but every attempt was futile. No matter where he went, the house would pull him back. The road that led him away twisted, contorted, and ended back at the front door, the house waiting for him. And every night, the whispers returned, growing louder, more desperate. The house seemed to grow hungrier, its grip on him tightening with each passing day. He couldn't escape. No one could. The messages were clear. The house wasn't just watching him. It was feeding on him. And soon, there would be nothing left. "Time is lost." The words echoed in his mind once more, and Simon realized with sickening clarity that the house had already claimed him. The house had always felt like it was alive, its creaking floorboards, whispering walls, and dark corners making it seem as though it were breathing, exhaling in soft, rattling sighs. But in recent days, the house had become something else. Something darker. Its grip on Simon had tightened, its pulse synchronized with his own, and now it felt as if he were tethered to it, bound by invisible strings. It started subtly, a subtle distortion in time. Simon would wake up, his body aching as though he'd been sleeping for hours, only to find that the sun had not moved, the clock had not ticked past a single minute. The air felt thick, suspended, as though nothing was allowed to shift. He'd look at the window, and the light was exactly the same, filtered through the same, dusty curtains. He'd glance at the clock, and the hands were frozen, the second hand motionless in its endless cycle. It happened again the next day, and the next. Simon tried to write, but the words refused to come. They felt hollow, like echoes of something that never existed. His mind swirled, spinning in place, chasing thoughts that always slipped away. He could feel the weight of the house pressing on him, the air too thick, the silence too heavy. He'd close his eyes for what he thought was a moment, only to find hours had passed without him even realizing it. By the time he tried to leave the house, it was too late. The front door, so sturdy and final, seemed to mock him. He stepped outside, breath coming in ragged gasps, eager for the fresh air, for the feeling of distance between himself and the house. But the driveway stretched before him, its gravel crunching underfoot, and no matter how far he walked, no matter how fast, the road wound back toward the same looming house. It was as though he had never moved. The house watched him from the distance, its dark windows like eyes, unblinking, cold. Simon stood there, disbelief flooding his veins, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned around, expecting to see the house far behind him, but there it stood, right in front of him, just as it always had been. His head spun. The air felt like it was pressing in from all sides. He tried again. This time he ran. But the road never ended. The trees blurred as he sprinted, his legs screaming with effort, the sound of his feet pounding against the gravel deafening. The air, thick and suffocating, clung to him like a shroud. His breath grew frantic, his mind screaming at him to stop, to turn, to look around. But the road stretched on, endless, looping in on itself. And no matter how far he ran, it always led him back to the house. It was as if the house was the center of a storm, its invisible pull too strong to resist. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as though the earth itself had conspired to trap him. The world shifted and twisted, and Simon's perception of time began to dissolve, fragmenting like shattered glass. When he finally collapsed on the doorstep, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, he wasn't sure how much time had passed. Hours? Days? Was it the same day? He couldn't be certain anymore. The house had him now. It had swallowed him whole, and no matter how hard he fought, there was no escape. The door creaked open with a slight push, as though it were welcoming him back. Simon stumbled inside, his knees weak, his mind reeling. And there it was again. The clock. The same hands, frozen at exactly the same time as before. That night, as he sat in the study, the walls felt tighter, closing in on him. The room seemed to pulse with some unseen rhythm, its very atmosphere thick with the weight of something malevolent, something ancient. He glanced at the desk, the pile of unfinished work stacked neatly beside his typewriter, but none of it seemed real. His own fingers moved mechanically, tapping at the keys in a rhythm that felt alien to him, the words coming out as though someone else were guiding his hands. He was writing, but it wasn't his story. It wasn't his reality. His eyes darted around the room, and the edges of the walls seemed to distort, flickering like the static of a broken television. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. His thoughts grew more disjointed, fractured, as though the very fabric of his mind was unraveling. He tried to stand, to get a glass of water, but his legs trembled beneath him. Each movement felt sluggish, as though the air itself was too dense, too oppressive. The house seemed to tighten its grip, wrapping him in a vice of dread. But when Simon turned back to the desk, the typewriter wasn't where he had left it. It was pushed aside, the chair pulled back, and in its place was a single sheet of paper. A sheet of paper that hadn't been there before. He reached for it, his fingers trembling, and pulled it from the typewriter. It was a message, written in thick, crimson ink. Don't leave. Simon's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the words, his mind unable to process the simple, terrifying message. The ink seemed to shimmer in the dim light, as though it was alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy. He stood there, frozen, until he heard a sound, a whisper, soft and distant but unmistakable. It was coming from upstairs. Buster. Simon's heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the stairs. The house seemed to hum with anticipation, the shadows stretching and twitching at the edges of his vision. Slowly, deliberately, he began to climb the stairs, each step heavy, his pulse quickening with each creak of the floorboards beneath him. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before him, dark and silent. The door at the end of the hall, the one that had always been locked, was ajar now. A sliver of darkness beckoned him, and with it came the faintest sound of breathing. Shuffling. Buster. But as he reached for the doorknob, a chill ran down his spine, colder than the air around him. The door swung open on its own, creaking as it revealed a room he had never seen before. It was a room as dark as a grave, empty save for a single chair in the center of the floor, facing a large, ornate mirror. A mirror that reflected nothing. Simon stepped inside, drawn to the emptiness. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tightening as he approached the mirror. As he reached for it, his reflection appeared, but it wasn't his reflection. The man staring back at him had hollow eyes, his face gaunt and sickly, as though it had been hollowed out by time and sorrow. Who was he? His reflection smiled, a twisted, mocking grin. And then the room began to spin. Simon woke up in his bed, drenched in sweat. His pulse hammered in his ears, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if the events of the past few hours had been a dream or reality. But as he opened his eyes, his gaze fell on the clock. The hands were frozen at exactly the same time. Midnight. And Simon realized, with a sickening jolt in his chest, that it had all happened before. The loop had begun again. The house had him now. Simon had already lost count of how many days had passed since he had entered the house. Time was an illusion here. Each morning, he awoke with the same dull, suffocating weight pressing down on him. He had tried to escape several times, but no matter what direction he drove, he always ended up at the same front door. Each time he left, the house mocked him, dragging him back like a spider reeling in its trapped prey. His mind, already frayed from the constant whispers and shifting shadows, was now a fractured thing. Memories slipped through his fingers like sand. Names, faces, details of his life, they were vanishing. The only thing that remained solid, unyielding, was the house. Then came the door. He had wandered the upstairs hallway countless times, his fingers grazing the walls as if searching for a way out. But today was different. A door he had never seen before. It was tucked away at the farthest end of the hall, hidden behind a thick, heavy curtain that draped over it like a shroud. His pulse quickened as he approached it, feeling an unnatural pull toward the spot. He had never noticed this door before, not once in all the time he had spent in this suffocating house. The wooden frame was aged and worn, the paint chipped, and the brass handle tarnished with time. It looked ancient, as though it had been forgotten by both time and those who had lived in the house before him. It didn't fit. It shouldn't be here. His fingers trembled as they brushed over the cold brass handle. A chill, deep and biting, ran up his spine. Something inside him screamed to turn back, to walk away, to leave the house, but he couldn't. The house had already claimed him, and now it wanted him to see this room. With a swift turn of the handle, the door creaked open, groaning as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. The moment it opened fully, the smell of old paper, dust, and mildew wafted out, clinging to his skin like a second layer. The room was dark, its only light coming from a sliver of dim sunlight that crept through the cracks in the window. As Simon stepped inside, the air grew thicker, heavier. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make his move. The floor creaked beneath his feet, and the wooden beams above him groaned, as if the house was alive, watching him with bated breath. The room was not large, but it was suffocating. It felt as though it had been untouched for decades, sealed away from the world outside. The walls were lined with old photographs, yellowed and curling at the edges, of a man Simon didn't recognize, standing in front of the house. The photographs were framed in tarnished gold, some of them cracked, but all of them depicting moments frozen in time. The man in the photographs was vaguely familiar, yet utterly foreign to Simon. His face seemed to blend with his own in strange, unsettling ways. There was something about his eyes, dark, hollow, like empty wells that had once held life, but now only reflected despair. Simon couldn't look away. He felt his heartbeat quicken, the room growing colder as he stared. The walls were also lined with shelves, stacked high with yellowing books and brittle papers. But it was the center of the room that truly caught his attention. There, standing like a monolithic object in the middle of the room, was a mirror. It was large, too large, the frame intricately carved with strange, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and move in the dim light. The wood was dark, almost black, and the edges were adorned with symbols that Simon couldn't quite understand. The mirror itself was filthy, streaked with dust and something darker, something that could be blood. It was as if the room had been created around this mirror, the photographs, and the papers only secondary to its presence. Simon felt a magnetic pull toward it, like a moth drawn to the flame. He couldn't explain why, but the mirror beckoned him. His legs moved of their own accord. He was walking toward it, unable to stop. Each step felt heavy, as though the room was dragging him closer. His breath caught in his throat as he reached the mirror's edge. The glass was smudged, cloudy, but still he stared into it. At first, he saw only his reflection, his pale face, tired eyes, the shadow of stubble on his chin. But then something shifted. The reflection wasn't right. His face was changing, slowly at first, but then with terrifying clarity. The skin grew darker, hollowing around the eyes as if drained of life. His hair turned thin and white, his features twisted, contorted into something unrecognizable. He reached a trembling hand toward the glass, but his reflection mirrored the movement too slowly, as if the man in the mirror was not Simon, but someone else entirely. A voice whispered in his ear, soft, slithering, familiar yet distant. "Do you recognize me?" Simon recoiled, his hand falling away from the mirror as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He blinked rapidly, but the image in the mirror remained the same. The man in the glass was no longer him. It was his uncle. It was his uncle's face, but it wasn't. It was his face. The same dark, hollow eyes, the same weary expression. But the face staring back at him from the mirror was older, gaunt, its features drawn with lines of suffering that Simon did not recognize. A sick realization clawed its way into Simon's mind. His uncle, the man who had left him this house, the man whose life he knew so little about. He was no different from Simon. They were one and the same. Simon felt his grip on reality slip further as the reflection continued to distort, the face of his uncle blending with his own, becoming an amalgamation of both, a twisted mockery of his identity. The room seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, the walls closing in, suffocating him. The air was thick, suffused with the scent of decay and madness. The mirror, now alive with the reflections of both Simon and his uncle, seemed to absorb all the light in the room. He could no longer breathe. "You've always been mine," the voice whispered again, growing louder, more insistent. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest, the room spinning around him. But as he tried to flee, his feet refused to move. The door that had once opened so easily now seemed locked, an invisible force holding him captive. No matter how hard he tried, he could not escape. Simon could feel his mind unraveling, his thoughts becoming incoherent. He was losing himself, just as his uncle had before him. The room was not just a physical space, it was a trap, a void, a place that devoured memories and souls alike. And Simon had been its next victim. In his last moments of clarity, Simon understood. The house had not just claimed his uncle. It had claimed him. Time had folded in on itself, and Simon had become nothing more than a reflection in that cursed mirror. He was part of it now, a piece of the house, forever trapped in its clutches. The mirror grew darker, and Simon's reflection smiled back at him, a cold, knowing grin that was both his own and his uncle's. And then there was nothing. The house had become his prison. It had taken his time, his memories, his sense of self, and now it was taking his very soul. Simon sat on the cold wooden floor of the forgotten room, his back against the wall, the dim light from the window casting long shadows over the faded wallpaper. The house, as if pleased with its work, had grown quieter, more patient. It watched him with a suffocating stillness, as though it had all the time in the world. And in a way it did. He could feel the weight of it in his chest, a crushing pressure that made it hard to breathe. His fingers were numb, but he still clutched the pen, his hand trembling, scrawling words that made no sense. Words he didn't fully understand but knew he had to write. The paper was covered in his desperate scratches, looping phrases that seemed to come from nowhere. "I must write. If I stop, I will forget. I must remember who I am. I must remember why I'm here." But the words were slipping, fading away as soon as they were written. His own handwriting looked foreign to him, the letters jagged and twisted, as if someone else's hand was guiding the pen. The journal before him felt more like a lifeline than a record, each word a fragile tether to whatever reality he still clung to. His mind. No, it wasn't his anymore. The house had poisoned it, devoured it slowly. The lines between reality and nightmare blurred with every passing minute. Memories slipped through his fingers like sand, vanishing into the cold air of the room. How long had he been here? A day? A week? Or had it been years? He couldn't remember, and that terrified him. Each time he tried to focus on his past, on who he was before this house, the details eluded him. The names of his family, his friends, gone. The simple act of recalling his own face seemed impossible. It was as though someone had taken an eraser to his life, wiping away everything, leaving behind only this oppressive emptiness. He looked down at the journal again. He had to keep writing. The words were the only thing holding him together. They were the only thing keeping him from slipping entirely into oblivion. A soft noise broke his concentration. It was faint, like the flutter of fabric against the floor. He paused, his pen hovering midair. The air in the room grew colder, impossibly so, and the shadows deepened, stretching toward him as if alive. His breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding as the silence stretched on. And then the door creaked open. Simon's head snapped up. The room, which had seemed so still just moments before, now seemed to pulse with a sickening energy. The door had been locked, or so he thought. He hadn't dared to touch it in days. But now it was ajar, just a crack, as though something, or someone, was waiting for him to notice. He pushed himself up, his legs weak beneath him. He stumbled toward the door, his breath shallow, the cold creeping into his bones. The door swung open further, revealing the dimly lit hallway outside. The house felt hungry. The walls seemed to breathe, and the floorboards groaned beneath his weight. He stepped out cautiously, his senses tingling with an unsettling awareness. The house was watching, pressing in from all sides. The once familiar hallways were now foreign to him, shifting and warping. The air felt thick, heavy, as if it had been soaking in something dark for years. A flicker of movement caught his eye. At the end of the hallway, in the distant corner, he saw it, a figure, tall and shadowed, standing motionless against the backdrop of the dim light. Simon's heart hammered in his chest as the figure remained still, unmoving, like an apparition. "Who's there?" Simon's voice trembled. His words seemed to disappear into the thick silence of the house. No answer. Simon's feet moved of their own accord, pulling him forward despite the terror clawing at his throat. His body felt like it wasn't his own, as though the house itself was guiding him, forcing him closer to the figure. The closer he got, the more distorted the figure became. It wasn't a person at all, not fully. It was a vague shape, a blur of shadow and light that seemed to shift with every step Simon took. The face was wrong. It was his face, but it wasn't. His eyes were hollow, his expression twisted in pain, as though trapped within a scream that would never end. Simon's breath caught in his throat as he reached out, his hand trembling, desperate to make contact with this reflection of himself. But as his fingers brushed the figure's shoulder, it vanished, as though it had never been there at all. In its place was only darkness. A sharp, jagged pain pierced his chest, and Simon staggered backward. His breath came in ragged gasps, his hands clutching at his sides. The house was tightening around him, squeezing him in its relentless grip. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick with something foul. His vision blurred as his knees buckled beneath him. He collapsed to the floor, his head spinning. His heart pounded in his ears as his fingers grasped desperately for the journal that had fallen from his hands. Write. Write. You must write. The words in his mind were frantic, like a chant he couldn't escape. He had to write. He had to keep writing, or else I'll forget. The floor beneath him felt colder, the air impossibly thin. His body felt distant, as if he were fading from existence itself. He could feel his memories slipping further away, like a dream he could no longer hold on to. In a final, desperate attempt, Simon gripped the pen once more. The words came, but they weren't his. They were the house's, scratching into the paper with a chilling urgency. This is who you are now. The letters began to form on the page, and as they did, they felt like a chain tightening around his soul. Simon couldn't stop himself. His mind was no longer his. The words he wrote weren't his own. They were the house's, part of the house, pulling him deeper into its depths. You are mine now. The final stroke of the pen came, and with it, a terrifying realization. He had become part of the house. The mirror in the corner of the room shimmered to life, and Simon's reflection stared back at him. But it wasn't his reflection. It was the man in the mirror, the one with hollow eyes and a twisted expression, the one who had been waiting for him all along. Simon's eyes widened in horror as he felt himself being consumed. The last shred of his identity, of who he was, slipped away, leaving behind only a shell. A broken, hollow man, lost to the house. He will never leave. As the final remnants of his memory vanished, the pen dropped from his hand. The house had won, and somewhere, deep within the walls, a new shadow waited. The house stood as it always had, silent, patient, and eternal. Simon Hart was no more. Once a man of rational thought and steady hands, he had become a forgotten soul, a lost fragment swallowed by the house. No one would remember his name or his brief existence. There were no records, no traces of the man who had once walked its halls. He was gone, replaced by something else, something nameless. The house, now satiated, resumed its eternal silence. The creaks and groans of the floorboards were quieter now, more controlled, as though the house had grown accustomed to its new resident. But every now and then, faint scratches echoed through the walls, as if something inside was still trying to write, trying to hold on to something that had long since slipped away. Outside, the seasons turned, and the world moved on. But the house remained. The neighbors spoke of the house, of course. It had been abandoned for years before Simon's arrival, but they never went near it. The house had a reputation, after all. It was a place that left you lost, broken, a shell of who you once were. And they knew deep down that it would always claim someone else. It always did. Some nights, when the wind was just right, they could hear something, a faint scratching, as though someone were desperately trying to write their name on the walls. But when they went to investigate, the house was empty. No one ever came out, and so it would remain. The house waited, ever patient, ever hungry, for the next visitor to come.